Why I Love Yiddish Fest 22. Go to yiddishfest.org for more information. 6 days, 10 events in Miami Beach, Boca Raton, and Coral Springs from August 30th through September 4th. The South Florida extravaganza of Jewish culture featuring contemporary Jewish headliners. Don't miss our hit musical concert, Stars of David, in Boca Raton on August 30th and Miami Beach September 1st. See Jewish rapper Kosha Dills live on Miami Beach September 1st. Yid Live, the award-winning Yiddish comedy duo Yid Life Crisis in Miami Beach and Boca Raton on September 3rd and 4th. And Avi Hoffman, still Jewish after all these years, at the Coral Springs Center on September 4th. And so much more. You don't have to be Jewish to love Yiddish Fest. For tickets and more information, go to yiddishfest.org. Naches for the entire mishpucha.
It's spirituality in a beautiful tradition.
Everyone, and welcome to another edition of Shmoozing with Avi. I am so excited about my guest today. I cannot even begin to express it because Deborah Kaplan has been a very important person in my life and career because of my work, especially in Yiddish theater, because of her specialty in that particular subject, but also because of her seminal essay on Death of a Salesman and its Yiddishkeit. So Debra Caplan is a Yiddish theater historian who began her career at the Yiddish Book Center. She's associate professor of theater in the Department of Fine and Performing Arts at Baruch College, City University of New York. Her research focuses on Yiddish theater and drama, theatrical travel, artistic networks, and immigrant theater. Her book, Yiddish Empire, which if you haven't read, you must. The Vilna Troupe, Jewish Theater and the Art of Itinerancy, was published by the University of Michigan Press in 2018. Yiddish Empire got awards from the Theater Library Association, the Modern Language Association, and her writing has appeared in Theater Survey, Theater Journal, Modern Drama, Comparative Drama, New England Theater Journal, Performance Research, Packenträger, the great Packenträger, and the American Theater Magazine. She's working on a new biography of the great Molly Pecan, who I adored and actually had the honor of meeting, and an edited collection entitled The Dybbuk Century, the Jewish play that possessed the world, co-edited with Rachel Merrill Moss for the University of Michigan Press. With Joel Berkowitz, she co-founded the Digital Yiddish Theater Project, a research collective that applies digital tools to the study of Yiddish theater. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I couldn't be more excited to welcome my guest, Debra Caplan. Deborah, please join me. I can't even.
Hello.
I can't even. I mean, the fact that you are a young woman who has found this amazing Yiddish theater specialization in your life is of so much interest to me. And I really want to know, I, of course, grew up in the Yiddish theater. My first professional job was in the Volksbühne when I was 10 years old. So I've been a part of Yiddish theater all my life. But where did you grow up? Where were you born? Where did you grow up? And why and how did you come to the world of Yiddish and Yiddish theater?
I grew up outside of Philadelphia, suburban Philadelphia, and I guess I came to it a couple of different ways. So I fell in love with theater when I was in elementary school, and that really never changed. Theater just there was something absolutely magical about it that just sort of captivated me from from childhood. And so for a long time, I thought I would go into theater, I'd become a director, and just kind of go into commercial theater, and that would be that. And but at the same time, I also grew up in a house where I was surrounded by Yiddish and Yiddish books. My father spoke Yiddish, and it was a real passion for him. And so our house was full of Yiddish books and records, and he got the forwards. And so that was sort of always kind of part of like the undercurrent of my life. I went to college
Did
thinking,
you speak Yiddish?
no, no. So I didn't speak it at all, but my
What
father did.
was what was your father's background? Where did your parents and
Oh my
grandparents
goodness.
come from? And why did he speak Yiddish?
Yes. My father's story was very unusual. I'm actually working on another book right now that is about my father's story because he had a really interesting and unusual um, childhood and upbringing and encounter with Yiddish. So my father grew up in Camden, New Jersey, and he grew up in a household where his mother, her parents, it was her grandparents who had immigrated, so she never spoke Yiddish. His father grew up in a Yiddish-speaking home with immigrant parents and rejected it, rejected everything about it. My grandfather would eat pork davka on Yom Kippur, like just davka, and my grandfather did not want to admit to anybody that he spoke a word of Yiddish, even though his parents, that was their native language and that was the language that he grew up in. But he was intent on being American, and to him, that meant a rejection of everything Jewish and everything Yiddish. And My father grew up kind of the awkward, bookish youngest child in this family. It wasn't a happy home. My grandfather was somewhat emotionally abusive. It wasn't a good situation. My father had no friends, and he found the one person who cared about him at the local Orthodox synagogue, who was this rabbi from Vilna, um, whose best language was Yiddish. And my father kind of came and had this idea that this was a space where maybe he could belong. He felt like he didn't belong anywhere, and so he started going to the synagogue after school, and the rabbi was tutoring him in Yiddish and in Talmud. And he basically got more or less a yeshiva education after school, one on one with this rabbi, who was sort of like the only person in his life who understood him. um, my dad, as like an 8, 9, 10-year-old kid, just you know felt like learning Yiddish was the key to something, and it was the key to understanding this rabbi's sermons, which were all in Yiddish. And he felt like that was the key to unlocking something about who he was that felt missing.
And is that where your fascination with the Vilna troupe and the Vilna? Because it's interesting.
Maybe a little. I mean, I think that came sort of from a different place. So I think so. To flash forward a little bit later in my own life, I when I was in high school, I got very interested in kind of avant-garde experimental theater. And I had the sense that like that was the kind of theater that I wanted to make and create. I went to college, and I happened to go to Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts. I had this vague sense that there was something Yiddish there, and that might be interesting for my father, but that wasn't why I went. I got to campus, and my dorm room looked out on the Yiddish Book Center, like looked out on the shtetl, picturesque against the mountains. I really needed a job, and I went to the office and said, how do I get a work study job? I need a work study job. And they gave me a list of what the options were for work study jobs. And, I could have helped out in the cafeteria or in some office, but, at the bottom of the list was, work study at the Yiddish Book Center. Prerequisites, we're looking for people who know the Hebrew alphabet and like books. And I was like, oh, I like that sounds like the most interesting thing on this list. And I'm kind of curious because this is my father's passion. And my father passed away when I was 18. So I went to college a few months after his death. And I thought that might be interesting for me, maybe healing. And so I showed up at the Yiddish Book Center, and one of those first days, I happened upon a collection of plays and started asking questions about them because even though I had grown up in a house full of Yiddish books, I didn't really know that there was Yiddish theater. Um, I hadn't put that together fully, and someone started talking to me about Yiddish plays, and and someone used the word experimental, and I thought like, oh my God, like I know about French experimental theater and Russian experimental avant-garde theater, and it never occurred to me that there was Jewish experimental avant-garde theater. Like, that's a really interesting thing. So I thought, maybe I'll learn. Nothing's translated, but I really want to read, so maybe I'll learn a little Yiddish just enough to be able to, read a little bit, understand, do my job better. I don't know. It seemed just for a summer, I'll just take some classes. I'll do this program and just see what happens from it. And it just became sort of an all-consuming passion from there.
Wow. So blown away. Before we get into a little deeper of where we're going, tell us about your mom's background and her family, perhaps. But
Sure.
more importantly, I want to know, when you were growing up, until 18, until you discovered the National Yiddish Book Center, what was your JQ, your Jewish quotient? What was your Yiddishkeit quotient, up until then?
Yeah. My parents both grew up in non-observant families, and they wanted to create the family they always wanted. So, we had a kosher home, and we were conservative but relatively observant. That was important to them. They both grew up with like nothing. And in my father's family, like a real specific rejection of everything Jewish. Um, I grew up, I think, kind of a very traditional sort of like American Jewish conservative household. I went to Hebrew school, and we were very involved with our synagogue. For a long time, I sort of saw it as something that belonged to my parents and not to me. And I thought, my interests are in the arts, right? And like, where are the arts here? Like I didn't really have that connecting point. So, I would say that I was like not that close to it, if that makes sense. But then, especially after my father passed away, there was a real curiosity about like, okay, I just sort of accepted that these things were his passions, but now I want to know why. Like, what about it was so interesting to him? Because we didn't really get to that point. I didn't get to be at an age where I could really like ask those questions. Yeah.
So your upbringing was more religious than it was cultural.
Yeah, so I think my upbringing had more cultural infusion than most. Yiddish music played a lot. I grew up kind of listening to Yiddish records and songs, and we had lots of Yiddish literature and translation in the house, and I read a lot of that. So in some ways, I grew up around more of the cultural side. And I think for my father, it was all one thing, right? I mean, I think I would describe his approach to Judaism as eclectic. I wouldn't say that it was exactly a conservative Jewish household, or it was an eclectically Jewish household. My father, there were things that he saw value in, and there were a lot of those things, and those were the things that we did and that were important, and there were other things he didn't see value in, and that's not what he did. So it was a very sort of individualistic, eclectic approach, and my father was, I mean, he the extent to which he believed in God was somewhat more of a question than a clear path. And that was part of how I was raised Jewishly as well. That some level of agnosticism is sort of part of the thing, part of the thing that we do. We question, and we discuss, and we debate, and that's
You say they never took you to the Yiddish
no.
theater.
No, never. I wish they had. My dad, interestingly, when he was growing up, what he would do, and again, he was very unhappy at home, on the weekends, after on like Sundays, he would go take the train to New York City by himself as like, again, like a 9, 10, 11-year-old kid. He'd go see Yiddish theater, and he'd spend entire days uh, pretending that he didn't speak English to see how far he could get. See if people might believe, that maybe he was an immigrant who spoke Yiddish, and maybe he didn't belong here in this like American suburban life. Maybe he came from somewhere else. And so he spent a lot of time, in communities, with a lot of like survivors and stuff in New York, kind of just as a kid, just practicing his Yiddish and going to Yiddish theater. But no, I did not experience it as a kid.
So what was the first show that you remember seeing?
Ever?
Ever? Yeah. What was the first
Oh,
theater?
oh my
Because you
goodness.
became so involved in theater. Obviously, something made a big impression.
It was Phantom of the Opera. So what happened was my cousin, my cousin who was a musician, he came to visit us, and he brought a cassette tape and he brought like a piano book for Phantom of the Opera, because he knew I was sort of getting interested in music, and and he thought I might like it. And he played the songs for me on the piano, and then we listened to the soundtrack, and he left me the book. I still have it. It's, all the pages are out of the binding, like they're, very well worn, because it had all the pictures and it had all sort of the description as well. And I just became completely obsessed. I was in third grade. I was 8 years old, and I was just completely obsessed with this show, and wanted to know everything I could about it. And so for my birthday, for my ninth birthday, my parents got me tickets and we went to go see it. And I was just completely blown away. Um, it really was like magic. It just felt like walking into this whole magical world. And then I kind of couldn't get enough.
Hmm. So let's keep going. You're now, working work study at the National Yiddish Book Center, and you're taking Yiddish classes.
Yes.
And what are you studying? What is your major in the meantime?
So at Hampshire College, every student designs their own major, and you do that in your second year. So it was right after I did the intensive summer program at the book center that I was coming up with my major, and I designed my major to be Jewish history, literature, and theater. That was what I wanted to study. Modern modern Jewish history, literature, and theater, and developed kind of a program based on that. And one of the first things I did was I had this independent study class that was learning Yiddish through reading plays. And over the course of the semester, I just really painstakingly, slowly read like 5 plays, with, an intense amount of having to look things up in the dictionary because my Yiddish wasn't very good. But I learned a tremendous amount from that.
What were the
Um,
plays? Do you remember what the plays were? I mean,
I
they were
remember
the
some of
famous,
them.
well-known, the Dib book, all the
I remember some of
classic.
what we read. So one of the first ones was the Kishafmacherin, Goldfaden's the Kishafmacherin.
First one.
I was challenged in this independent study because, of course, if you read these older plays, a lot of them are in Deutschmarisch, and my professor was like, the language is harder to find in dictionaries. And my professor was like, well, here's a list of dictionaries. Like, you need not just like these good Yiddish dictionaries and the Lush and Kodesh dictionary, but also like you should have this good German dictionary, this Russian one, this Polish one. We're going to learn how, when you can't find a word, like we're going to learn how to look it up across the board. So we also read a real challenge. We read Circula, Edinger's Circula, which of course is partially in German and partially in really intense Deutschmarisch and partially in really good Yiddish, but with a lot of slang. And those plays were, it was a challenge, but it was also really exciting to sort of unlock that. And then we read some more modern plays. I think we read Grünefelder. I think that was one of the more like we'd read at least one Hirschbein, and I think it was Grünefelder. Um, and I think we read the Dybbuk in that semester, but yeah,
Right.
kind of a cross
Classic Yiddish.
section,
Right.
cross section of what's out there in Yiddish theater, and just to get a sense of how to read these plays. Yeah, so I ended up continuing to pursue this. My major on paper was what I told you, but in practice it became Yiddish theater. So it was good to be at a place where I could do that. And then my senior thesis was translating 2 Yiddish plays and directing one of them and doing a production.
And which were they?
So it was Die Kirschmacher, and I went back to the Sorceress, Goldfaden Sorceress,
Right.
and Hotzmachspiel, which is an Itzik Monger play from the 1930s that is an adaptation of the Sorceress. And it's wildly inventive and delightful and kind of modernist and absurd in all sorts of interesting ways.
So you were fascinated by the concept of experimental theater at the same time that you were exploring the most classic of Yiddish theater.
Yes.
But interestingly enough, I don't see those things as separate. You know, the
They're not.
original Yiddish theater was very experimental, especially when you go back to Stanislavski and
Yeah.
Chagall designing sets for Yiddish theater, and it was all very crazy, abstract, and experimental in many ways. So tell us how you went from there to becoming what I believe, at least in my opinion, I'm sure there are others who would agree, really one of the experts in the world in this particular field. I mean, you are, as far as I'm concerned, one of the most knowledgeable people about Yiddish theater in the world today. And you wrote books. Tell us about how you went from being a student, with a graduate thesis to writing all these amazing books and really, in some ways, revolutionary looks at the Yiddish theater, which will eventually get us to Death of a Salesman.
That's very kind. And I should say that, like, thankfully, there are quite a few of us Yiddish theater historians out there, and it is a field that is at the moment growing in some really exciting ways. So I'm very grateful that there's a real sense of field about it, and I would say a growing sense of field, as opposed to just a few people, which is lovely. So so what happened next? I decided this was the passion. This was what I was going to pursue. I went to graduate school to do a PhD in Yiddish and to focus on Yiddish theater, and that's precisely what I did. And that's where I started working on the Vilna Troupe project. And really, the way that came about is because what I did was I started as a director, right? And I do think of theater, I think, from that standpoint. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to write a dissertation about, I thought, okay, who are the directors that I think did the most interesting work? There's a lot of literary scholars writing about Yiddish theater. There's not as many people writing about the sort of practitioner side. Um, and I wanted to dig into that. And I thought, okay, who are the directors? What are the productions that I think are the most interesting things that ever happened in Yiddish theater? And I made a list. And I thought, great, I'm going to go ahead and, go to the lexicon and read the biographies of all of these directors and try to figure out what they have in common. And, I'll write some sort of dissertation about experimental Yiddish theater, probably in the interwar period. And, what do these people have in common? How did they get their ideas? How are they connected, et cetera, et cetera. And so I started reading these biographies of these biographical profiles of these different directors. And very, very quickly, I noticed a very common theme, which was that every single one of them, without exception, every single one of them, the Vilna Troupe was in there somewhere. And in most cases, it was started their career with the Vilna Troupe, right? But in every single case, they all had the Vilna Troupe in common. And I thought, well, that's odd. Like, there's a lot of people on this list. They worked in a lot of different places geographically, lots of different types of theater. How the heck did they all work with one theater company? Like, how big was this thing? So I thought, okay, great. My next step, I'll go read the book on the Vilna Troupe, and then I'll figure this out. And of course, what I found was that there was no book on the Vilna Troupe in any language, none whatsoever, including in Yiddish, which was surprising because there are books in Yiddish on many other theater companies that are very detailed. But the Vilna Troupe, there was just this gap. And I thought, well, that's the oddest thing, because what theater company in Yiddish was more famous than the Vilna Troupe? How is it, and all these people started their careers there. How is it possible that there's no book that explains that? That doesn't make any sense. So it became sort of a mystery that I tried to unravel. And what I ended up writing about in my dissertation and then later a book about the Vilna Troupe is that the Vilna Troupe was not just one theater company in one place. It was a constellation of different theater companies that operated kind of like a brand, all competing with each other in many different geographical places. It was kind of like a brand or a transnational movement, and that's how all these people got their start there. But it was also this idea of Yiddish theater is for experimentation. It was a
Right,
set of
the
aesthetic
actor's
ideas.
studio, the actor's studio. So everybody went to the actor's studio and then created their own
Exactly.
things, right? But I'm sure many
Exactly.
books have been written about the actor's studio. Why
There
do
are
you
lots.
think, why do you think there was no book written about the film?
Well, I think in English, I think, you could say, well, there's a lot of seminal people that don't have a book about them. I mean, the first book about Avram Goldfaden just came out pretty recently. He was the father of Yiddish theater, right, in English. However, many books in Yiddish on him, right? In Yiddish, it's a more interesting question, or in other languages. What I found in my research is that lots of people tried to write books about the Vilna Troupe and stopped. And people wrote about why they stopped. So, you know, several people who started writing profiles or books about the Vilna Troupe, they would write something in the newspaper and get a lot of hate mail from people. And the hate mail would say, "You've got it all wrong. That the one in Romania, that's not the real Vilna Troupe. The real Vilna Troupe is the one in Paris right now with so and so and so and so." And so a lot of there are several theater historians who wrote things like, "I'd like to write more about the Vilna Troupe, but it's just a little hard to do because nobody could really agree on what it was, where it was, who it was." And it was a real point of disagreement. There were actors who would start their own company and call it the Vilna Troupe, and everybody else would say, that's not a real Vilna Troupe." So when you're writing about the Vilna Troupe, what is it? I think it was really hard to do, and these people were actively working and alive, because it was a real threat to their livelihood to start saying, this Vilna Troupe is real or original, or this is how it works. I think it was tricky. And then I think also just, because the Vilna Troupe was in so many places at so many times. Joseph Bullock, who was in the troupe, he wrote, I found this note in his archives where he wrote, it's basically advice for a future historian of the Vilna Troupe, and it's pretty daunting. He says, anybody who would want to know about the Vilna Troupe would need to know, right? And he gives a list of languages. And it's a long list. It's like 35 languages. And he says, if you don't know these 35 languages, you can't write a history of the Vilna Troupe. Like, you don't know what you're talking about. So it's a daunting prospect. I do not know 35 languages, but I did get some translators to help me, and I learned along the way. Like, I had a very active relationship with a Dutch translator. I needed a lot of material translated from Dutch, and that material was vitally important. And if I couldn't have accessed it, it would have been a real detriment. So same with Romanian, same with so he had a point.
So, could you tell our viewers a little bit about? I mean, I know something. I don't know nearly as much as you, but I know a little. Can you tell us about the Vilna Troupe and its significance in the iconography of Yiddish theater?
Sure. Well, the Vilna Troupe was the first company anywhere in any language to produce the Dybbuk, which was thought before their 1920 production to be an unproducible play. In fact, many people thought, not just in Yiddish circles, but in Russian circles, and Ansky tried to get the play produced in three languages: Yiddish, Hebrew, and Russian. And he did not succeed in getting it produced in his lifetime. It was only produced after his death. People saw it as a bad play. They thought it was a really bad play that had no dramaturgical anything to it. In fact, there's a great moment in Avram Marevsky's memoir. So Avram Marevsky was part of the Vilna Troupe and became famous for playing the role of Rebbe Zriel, the Mirapoler Rebbe who exercises the Dybbuk. And he was at one of these little salon gatherings where Ansky was trying to get the play produced. And he told Ansky, his feedback to the author was, there are no good parts for actors in this play. So what an irony that after the author dies, he becomes famous for this incredible acting role in this play that he read and he heard read out loud, and he thought, there's no good roles for actors. That was his feedback. So the play was ahead of its time. It was misunderstood. The Vilna Troupe, they understood it and they saw the potential for it. And they agreed to produce it before Ansky's death. He died suddenly, and they accelerated their plans and produced it in 1920, and it became an absolute viral sensation. It became huge and really launched them into the public consciousness. So I would say the Vilna Troupe's important for a couple of reasons. Number one, they brought us the Dybbuk. Without them, the Dybbuk would never have happened. And the Dybbuk is, one of, if not the most famous and important Yiddish plays of all time.
You're actually writing a book about it, yes?
I am, yes. So there's a volume that I hope will be coming out soon. That's a collection of essays about the Dybbuk. It's called The Dybbuk Century, and it's about 100 years of the Dybbuk from 1920 to roughly 2020, and then some a little bit. How it played out.
I'm curious if you know how many productions have been done of the Dybbuk. I mean, probably thousands, if not tens of thousands.
There is no year since 1920 without a Dybbuk production somewhere. Not a single year. It is constantly being produced. But more than that, it's also been adapted in all of these really interesting ways. There was Leonard Bernstein and Jerome Robbins adaptation, the Dybbuk Ballet. There's several operas. There have been various movies, and so it's something that has kind of come to live in the popular imagination
Tony
in some really
Kushner,
interesting
right?
ways.
Didn't Tony
Tony
Kushner?
Kushner's play,
Of
of
course.
course. So
Yeah.
there's a wide range. So the book is really about why has this play captivated people in so many different ways for over a century. That's all, that's, it's unusual for a play to do that, to be so consistently drawing public attention and adaptation. Why has this play become such an important fixture of our sort of Jewish cultural imagination
And
for
there's
100 years
also
and counting?
a film version,
Yes, yes,
which
there
brings me
is.
to the next question. How most people don't really know a lot about the world of Yiddish film and how connected it was to the Yiddish theater. Can you tell us a little bit about the world of Yiddish film and its connection to Yiddish theater of the 20th century?
Sure. Well, I would say just first of all that I think um, the whole idea that theater and film are separate entities is actually relatively recent. Like if you think about early film in almost any cultural sphere, early film was very intimately connected to theater. In fact, if you look at, I show these to my students all the time, if you look at the very earliest films, the very first films, the Thomas Edison films, they didn't know what to make films about, right? And so, they did a lot of films at vaudeville houses. Why? Because vaudeville acts are short. You needed something to record that was 1 to 5 minutes long, right? These short little segments. So, the idea was like, well, we just transition this from one medium to another. So the whole idea of film as a different thing is sort of newer, right? Even pre-World War II, it's still kind of, there's this idea that you take successful plays and you put them on film, and that's how you make great films. Which obviously now is not always the case anymore. In fact, it's sometimes the reverse, that you have a movie and then you make it into a play.
Right.
But
And very often plays that become films don't do so well because
correct.
they lose, the essence of the drama sometimes in that transition.
Yeah, they're different mediums, but people didn't really get that at first, right? So they thought of it as some of the same space. In any case, Yiddish film had a sort of briefly, very intensely flourishing moment in the 1920s and 30s, and a significant proportion of the films that were made in that period are based on plays. They're adaptations of plays, and often quite brilliant ones. Even the ones that are not adaptations of plays are often featuring actors or personalities from the theater, including especially Molly Picon, very famously, is a lot of there are a lot of film vehicles that are built around um, her persona and her acting style, and that people know from the theater, but getting it out to a larger audience.
Right. And so that's another project that you're working on, a biography of
Yes,
Molly, right?
yes,
Right.
yes. Which also, a seminal person. It hasn't been done. She wrote two sort of autobiographical kind of popular books, which are great. They're great reads, but they're not sort of historically situated like proper biographies per se. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Right. I mean, Molly was one of the most significant, if not the most significant in many ways, because she was able to popularize the Yiddish theater in a way that I don't think anybody, before and after really did. Uh,
Yeah,
everybody had their own, whether it was Maury Schwartz or Jacob P. Adler, each one of them had their thing that
yeah.
they did, that they specialized in. But Molly somehow was able to transcend all of those. Tell us a little bit about what you've learned about Molly.
She was extraordinary. Often what we do as theater historians, you're trying to capture these sort of ephemeral performance events. You're trying to capture these ephemeral, creations um, that you can never quite access, right? So like I never had the privilege to see her perform in person, right? And so there's always that sort of barrier between me and her in writing this book. And yet, um, you know, what you can see is just how extraordinary and impactful her performances were. there are some performers that just, they walk on stage and people are just drawn to them and can't take their eyes off. There's a charisma, there's a, and when you see it, you know, and she had it, she had that in droves. So I think that part of why she was able to transcend so much was just because of her extraordinary talent, truly, truly extraordinary. But also what I think is so interesting about her is that she did not fit the mold of what Yiddish actresses were supposed to do or be. She created a totally new mold for herself. So when Molly started her career, first of all, she started as an English language vaudeville actress. She did not start in Yiddish theater. She did not come into Yiddish theater until the 1918 pandemic. And the 1918 pandemic is why she came into Yiddish theater. It's an amazing story. So she was on tour with a vaudeville group called the Four Seasons. There were four, she was a professional vaudeville actress on kind of like second-rate vaudeville circuits. She was on a circuit that was like known as kind of the circuit you didn't want to be on, right? She was on the circuit that was going to like Montana and like, out west. And not making a lot of money, but trying to make it as a vaudeville performer. She was with this group called the Four Seasons. There were four girls, and each of them was a different season, and they each had an act. So I think she was winter. And then the pandemic hit, right? And all the theaters shut down. So she's on tour, and she was in Boston, which was like the best stop on her tour. She's from Philly. She's in Boston. Everything shuts down, and she's stranded. And she was supposed to, you get paid based on how the tour is going, right? So of course, the vaudeville circuit's like, we're not going to pay you. We can't pay you because we have no income right now. Every theater in Boston is shut down. So she's stuck in Boston. It's the middle of winter. It's 1918. There's a giant pandemic. All the theaters are closed. She has no money to get a train to get home, right? It's a scary time. Well, every theater in Boston was shut down except for one. There was one theater that was still open, and she heard about it through word of mouth, and she thought, okay, I'll check out this theater. And the theater that was open, it was open because the authorities had overlooked it. They hadn't put up the sign saying this theater is closed due to the pandemic. It was a theater that was part-time a boxing ring, which is why they didn't realize it was a theater, and part-time a Yiddish theater. And that was run by this young guy named Jacob Kalich, who was like 20 something years old, in his early 20s. And, and they didn't tell him to shut it down. So he didn't shut it down. So they were still having boxing matches and occasional performances. And Molly walked up to his door, on a snowy day and said, I need a job. I'm an actress. I'm stuck here. You're the only theater in town. What can we do? And he A, fell in love with her, and B, decided that he was going to write Yiddish theater for her. And he was going to make her a star. She sang for him, she performed for him, and he said, do you know any Yiddish? And she said, not really. And he said, I'm going to make you a Yiddish theater star. And so they were in Boston for a while with very middling success. He had all these contacts in New York when the theaters in New York reopened, over the next year or so. He wrote to people. He said, I have this incredible young ingenue. She's going to be a great star. They went to New York together, and people took one look at her and they said, no way. Because she was not even 5 feet tall, right? She was like 4'11". She had a very sort of diminutive frame. And Yiddish actresses in those days were supposed to be sort of, buxom ladies, right? They were not supposed to look like her. She looked kind of like a child, right? And they wouldn't, in most cases, they wouldn't even let her audition. They definitely didn't consider her for any parts. And so Jacob and Molly, in 1918, in 1920, they thought, maybe we'll just get married. And they got married. Maybe we'll have a family. She got pregnant. She had a terrible late-term miscarriage and went into a horrific depression where she couldn't get out of bed. And Jacob had this idea, we're going to leave Boston. We're going to go to Europe. I'm going to make you a star in Europe. So they went to Paris, and Jacob wrote to his contacts in Paris, and he said, I have this amazing Yiddish theater star. She is all the rage in America. He didn't mention she couldn't get a booking in New York. She's all the rage. Everyone loves her. Totally new type of actress. You have to see her perform. Some Yiddish theater in Paris booked her, and it started to turn around for them. She started to do incredible. And by the time she got back to New York, everybody in New York was like, oh, we want a piece of this, because in Europe she was big business.
What
So
was
that's
her
kind of their story.
what was her first big hit?
Yankala,
Yankee,
which they wrote together, where she played, you know, she wasn't getting these roles as the bucks and ladies. She played a mischievous young boy, who was breaking all the rules at his cheder, but was lovable. And and people loved her in those roles. She did acrobatics. She had a
oh,
little shtick where she had a thing where for every show for a while in the 20s, she would learn some new skill. Like she would learn to play the ukulele, or she would learn to do back tucks, or in one she in the Circus Girl, she learned to do rope tricks, like aerial rope tricks on a rope, and she trained with circus performers. So she was a wildly inventive performer, and once they got her in front of audiences, people loved her. But it was hard for her to get seen. She was
until
unusual.
till the end of her career, she was doing somersaults on stage.
That's correct. That's correct.
And
In her
I got
80s.
to meet her much later in life. Where did Yidel Mitten Fiedel fit in?
So Yidel Meet Fiddle was in 1936, if I remember correctly. I think it was the first of the four Joseph Green films that were all really extraordinary. She was a very established star by that point, very, very much so. She had done some film earlier on. She did a film in the early 1920s when she was still in Europe, called East and West, which is a silent film, more or less. It's wonderful. But she wasn't very happy with it. It didn't do very well. There was a lot of drama with how it fell apart. They actually went somewhat bankrupt over it. It was a really difficult thing for her. So she had this desire to get back into film and have a big success, because her first foray didn't go very well. And so yeah, Yidel Mittenvittel she was very excited to do that, and of course it was a huge hit. And then she did several other films as well, Mamala, and a bunch of others that were just
Right.
all
Mamala,
gigantic hits.
if I'm not mistaken, Mamala is where she sang A Big Gesinn.
That's right.
And
That's
she
right.
wrote the lyrics. I mean,
That's
I was
right.
especially blown away to learn that she was writing also. She was contributing to the actual creation of these pieces.
They were a real partnership. And one of the things that I find really interesting is that, um, Jacob got a lot of the credit for their writing, but if you look at how they actually worked, they were tremendously collaborative. She was a writer. She was a Yiddish theater writer, just as much as he was, and just as much. And even when she worked with Rubchinsky, or she worked with, like, she wrote a lot of lyrics, and she was very involved in that part of the creative process. So I think she doesn't get enough credit for the writing that she did.
And as you probably know, women very often were not given those opportunities or
That's
not
exactly it.
recognized for that. Listen, even Address Unknown, had to be written under a pseudonym because it was written by a woman, and they
Right.
would not accept a woman as a writer at that time. Um,
Women's plays did not get produced, right? So if she had taken more credit, it wouldn't have gone so well. I think there was also, so before she came along, Jacob Kalich, yes, he was a writer. He was also an actor. He gave up his acting career to push her career forward because he recognized that she was the greater talent. But he had to, I think there were feelings about that. I think it was a challenge in their marriage. I think it was important to her that he get a certain degree of credit because he would go into interviews and people would joke about how he was Mrs. Molly Pecan. It must have been, I think it was hard for him. I think it wasn't easy,
right,
to give up
especially
his career
during
in that
that
way.
time. Right,
Yeah,
today he'd wear it as a badge of honor. Joe Biden says, "I'm Joe Biden's husband."
right.
Today's a different story.
In the
Um,
20s, it was different. Yeah.
well, I can't wait until the movie
It
of Molly Pecan's life is made,
would
and
make a
you write
great
the
movie.
screenplay, and it's based on your book, and I'll be happy to be a part of it in any way I can. I could talk to you for hours and hours, but we're already, 40 minutes in, and we have to talk about Death of a Salesman.
Yes,
You mentioned Joe Buloff as part of the Vilna troupe, and Joe Buloff, of course, the story of him and his adaptation of Death of a Salesman, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the greatest stories of Yiddish theater ever. Can you tell us a little bit about your brilliant I guess it was a dissertation, um, right, on
It
Death of
was
a
just an
Salesman?
article that I wrote, but yes.
Just an article.
An
Okay,
article that I had
because
thought about a lot. Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
because it was called Attention Must Be Paid,
Yeah.
Death of a Salesman's Counter-Adapted Yiddish Homecoming.
Yeah.
Um, and your that particular article became one of my most important elements of research when I did Death of a Salesman
I'm
in
so glad to hear that.
oh God, it was my Bible. I mean, literally, that became my Bible. Can you tell us a little bit about Joe Buloff's, story and adaptation of Death of a Salesman?
Definitely. I've always been fascinated by this. If you read one of the things I was really interested in when I wrote this article is that if you read scholarship on Death of a Salesman, people very often mention, oh, there was this Yiddish adaptation that critics said was better than the original. But nobody had ever really written about it or looked at it. So, I saw all these mentions and I thought it was really interesting. And of course, I was working on this Vilna Troop book, and Joseph Boloff was a huge part of that. And I was going through his papers, and there was so much material about the Death of a Salesman production, including really interesting correspondence between him and Arthur Miller. And I thought, I got to write something about this. Like, this is a great side project. It's so interesting. So it's you know, Death of a Salesman is famously a play that Arthur Miller originally said was not about Jews or Jewishness in any way, but then later at the 50th anniversary of the play said it is about Jews who are kind of light years away from their Jewishness, right? So, and he said many times that like the main character, that Willie Loman, was sort of based on his uncle and his uncle's story, and so you know, there's this element of sort of like hidden Jewishness to the play itself. And that you can read the play, I think, interestingly through a Jewish family lens, as kind of a Jewish family play. Um,
Well,
Joseph Buluff certainly did.
but before we even get to Joseph Buloff's adaptation, the original name of Death of a Salesman was not Death of a Salesman. It's all in his head.
Yeah.
And if I remember my research correctly, and I think a lot of this came from you, is the characters were not named Linda and Willie and Hap and Biff. The characters had Jewish names.
They had more Jewish names that were changed. Yes.
Right. So
Yes.
it was more Elia Kazan's influence as the director who I believe really turned it from a Jewish play to a generic American, even though they're in Brooklyn,
I
you
mean,
know.
yeah, it was the director, but also like Arthur Miller wasn't comfortable with it. He was it was the time and the place where people were changing their names and hiding their identities, and he wasn't going to make it a Jewish play either, right? Like there was discomfort for him, even though he was writing based on his family. There was this sense of discomfort of it can't be too Jewish,
Right.
this sense of concern around that. But Joseph Bullock writes this Yiddish adaptation of it that is very faithful to the original in many ways. And Arthur Miller, I mean, Arthur Miller was famous for being very protective of how his plays were produced, especially Death of a Salesman. And there were all sorts of rules, especially around doing plays, within a certain number of miles of radius of New York City, and he made exceptions for this Yiddish play. He was interested in that happening in a way that was not typical for the way that he approached other adaptations or things in other languages. So that I thought was really interesting, that Arthur Miller himself there was a sense of like, well, how would this sound in Yiddish? And then of course, when people saw it, the reaction was sort of universally like, oh, this play makes so much more sense in this language. It's what it was supposed to be. It's what Arthur Miller was scared to write. He didn't write the real thing, right? He wrote this sort of very careful, but like in Yiddish, there's something more authentic about it, and so much of the character motivations make more sense. So yeah, I mean, I dug it in the article into kind of what happened in the adaptation and what things were changed, because there were changes that were made to sort of Judaize these characters a little bit more. Um,
But even
But
so, the language it's interesting. Joan Copeland, Arthur Miller's sister, came to see our production of Death of a Salesman 3 times.
wow.
And every time she came to me afterwards crying because she said, this is what Arthur Miller wanted the play to be. And when you look at some of the lines, and this is famous for academia, I'm sure you probably know much more about it than I do, the idea that some of the language, even in English,
Definitely.
almost sounded like Yiddish translated.
For example,
Attention must
attention
be
must be
paid.
paid. It's
Right.
a weird thing to say in English, right? We ought to pay attention, or but
Right.
attention must be paid to such a man. Is
Right.
that there's something Yiddish about that, and it's not the only line.
Right.
Absolutely.
And it's not the only line. There's a famous line that every time I said it, I thought, yes, this is exactly it. In English, um, in the scene with the woman from Boston, he says, when are you coming back? When will I see you again? I don't remember exactly what her line is. And Willie says, oh, 2 weeks about.
Yep.
2 Wochen
Yeah.
herum. In zwei
Yeah.
Wochen herum. In 2 weeks about. In two,
Definitely.
yes. And so that's why I loved your essay. I just thought it was so brilliant. So tell us, because I'm fascinated by Joe Buloff's approach to Arthur Miller. So tell us a little bit more about the actual sequence of production that Joe Buloff did with Death of a Salesman.
Goodness, it's gonna take me back because it's been a little while since I've written that article. But there was there was
Well, the
I
first
bel
production
in
was
Buenos Aires.
in Buenos Aires.
Yes, yes. Which was sort of like Buenos Aires was a major center for Yiddish theater. It was kind of where you went for the off season because the off season in New York was the on season in Argentina, and there was just a huge Yiddish theater scene, and it was very common for New York actors and productions to be there during the off season. So the Buenos Aires production, it was kind of like an out of town tryout, except in Argentina. Um, for bringing it to New York. And what was really interesting about that production was that it was, I believe, it was the first Death of a Salesman production in Argentina, and the Spanish language actors, like people were coming to see this play that they'd heard so much about, even though it was in Yiddish. And the productions in Argentina in Spanish that were inspired by what they saw from the Yiddish production.
Right. And Buloff adapted it with his wife, with Luba.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
Yeah, which is a
They were
wonderful.
also a married creative team. Yes, yes, yes,
Right.
yes.
So,
Exactly.
so I remember very well that then he wanted to do it in New York, in Brooklyn, and he had to write to Arthur Miller. My understanding is that he wrote Arthur Miller a letter and he misspelled his name,
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
which takes a lot of chutzpah, to write to Arthur Miller and say,
Yes,
Dear Mr. Muller.
yes,
And in essence, he basically said to him, I produced your show without the rights in Argentina.
yes,
I
he
didn't
did.
ask for your permission. It was a big hit.
Tremendous
See the
chutzpah.
reviews. And if I were you, I would give me the rights to do it in Yiddish all over the world.
Yep.
Is that basically your
That's
understanding?
exactly what he did, and it's shocking that Arthur Miller didn't sue him. I mean, especially given how controlling Arthur Miller was over how his work was done. I mean, this was a tremendous violation, and Arthur Miller was just kind of intrigued rather than upset, which is sort of shocking. And yeah, and Bullough, I mean, I think he genuinely believed this was he was putting together the real play. Like he was informing the author that like I did this thing that's really amazing, and yeah, like if you know what's good for you, you should see it.
Well, and maybe that is the proof in the pudding that Arthur Miller really wanted it to be a
I
Jewish.
think it is. And at that time, Arthur Miller was not, I mean, he was very strongly resisting any sort of comparisons of this play to Jewish anything. It really wasn't until decades later that he was even willing to start to admit that there was something else there.
Right.
But in a sense, in Yiddish, right, like with Bullough, with this production, he was kind of admitting that. he just wasn't doing it so publicly. So this whole idea that Arthur Miller, for all these years was so insistent that there was nothing Jewish about this play. I mean, sure, except not to the Yiddish theater audience. The
Right,
Yiddish theater audience saw behind that curtain before the rest of the world did.
right, right. Wow, wow. I'm so intrigued. Like I said, I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. By the way, just FYI, the Arthur Miller Estate has given our organization the rights and permission to film Death of a Salesman in Yiddish
Wow,
as a feature film.
that's amazing.
So we're going to try to raise the money to actually make that happen and really fulfill full circle the Yiddishness of Death of a Salesman. Tell us a little bit about what you have coming up in terms of Yiddish, but I also want to just touch on your rhinoceros post on Twitter. Because I found it fascinating and I thought you were going in a very different direction. So, what do you have coming up? And then let's talk about rhinoceros.
I mean, I think I sort of already talked about a little bit what I have coming up. The Dybbuk book
Right,
and the Molly Picon biography. That's kind of it, more or less.
right.
But yeah, rhinoceros. So I think first of all, as I was writing that tweet, I kind of gone in any number of directions. I is there a more relevant play in this day and age than rhinoceros? I'm not sure. For a million reasons, not just for one or two. But I was walking around New York City and just sort of observing just what's happening right now with like cases are surging and there's all of these things happening with COVID and there's a lot of people who are really intent on pretending that it's not. But the more people that pretend that it's not, the harder it is and the weirder it feels to be the sort of person who's like not engaging in that. It becomes a kind of group think. And I just had this moment where I was like, God, it's just like when everyone starts turning into a rhinoceros. And at first it's so weird and bizarre and whoa. And then it's like, well, why aren't you doing that? Right. Just you hit a certain inflection point and suddenly there's enough rhinoceroses that it's like, well, that's what everybody should be. And if you're thinking differently about it, then like something's wrong with you, right? Rather than the other way around.
Right. And I guess
But the whole
concept
groupthink is
of, right,
there's a lot
groupthink,
to say about groupthink in
conformity,
a lot of ways, right?
right, going along with the
Right.
crowd and everything else.
Certainly, from a political standpoint, there's
Right.
lots to say, and so he wrote the play. UNESCO wrote the play, thinking about politics very specifically and thinking about fascism very specifically, and certainly it holds that way too. But I think like all good plays, right? Like it can you can think about it differently to fit the moment that you're in. So I think there are many ways to read that play right now that are equally productive.
I'd be fascinated to hear, as we bring this to a close, how you think Yiddish theater
Mhm.
affected and the Yiddish experience, not just Yiddish theater, but the whole Yiddish world of experience, and especially during the war and after the war, how it affected some of the great writers like Samuel Beckett, Ionesco.
Yeah.
When I was doing Waiting for Godot in Yiddish, I did my research and found that Samuel Beckett had many writer friends who were Yiddish writers who had lived or survived or not survived the Holocaust. And that was very influential on his writing of Waiting for Godot, even though there is none of that, just like Death of a Salesman is not a Jewish play in any way, shape, or form when it's produced. Waiting for Godot certainly has nothing to do with anything that related in any way, shape, or form to the mountain of corpses that Beckett is writing about,
Yeah.
in Waiting for Godot. Do you have an opinion about the influence of Yiddish theater on the mainstream
Yeah.
writers of the time?
I think it's a tremendous and sometimes hidden influence, and I'll tell a story about Ionesco that I really love. So Joseph Bulloff, who, as we've already learned from talking about him, right, he was not a shy person, right? He thought rather highly of himself, and maybe rightly so. He was a tremendous Yiddish theater actor, really, really tremendous human. Um, uh, but so we can take this maybe with a grain of salt, but But Bullough wrote and spoke many times about conversations with Ionesco about his career. So when Ionesco was in his 20s, he was living in Romania, and the Vilna troupe spent quite a lengthy time in Bucharest, the branch of the Vilna troupe that Bullough was part of, Bullough and Cadison. And they were, it was in 1924, they were doing some wildly inventive work. I mean, really stuff like nobody was doing in theater at that time, really wacky sort of stuff. Ionesco saw some of the Vilna troupe productions in Bucharest at the time, as did like much of the Romanian intelligentsia in that period. So Bullough claims that years later, Ionesco called him and said, it's thanks to seeing the Vilna troupe and thanks to seeing those Yiddish theater productions that I became a playwright. And like that I became an experimental playwright, and sort of talked about his whole ideas of absurdist playwriting as, seeing that plays could do that, starting with, Yiddish theater and the Vilna troupe. Did that phone call actually happen? I mean, I could imagine it happened. Sure, why not, right? But, there's no hard evidence that it happened, but it's something that Bullough talked about a lot. And it's certainly plausible Ionesco was there at the time in Bucharest in that period. The Vilna troupe's audiences were like 75% Romanian. Everybody who was anybody in Bucharest was coming to see these plays. Right. It's plausible, right? So if you take that as a fact, then, what effect did Yiddish theater have on theater of the absurd? Well, quite a large one then, right? So, and it's not the only story like that.
Has Rhinoceros been done in Yiddish?
That I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised.
I'm ready. Let's do it. I say start translating and let's go.
But I think that would be really interesting. I think that would be a very interesting thing to do.
A very important piece.
Yeah.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot tell you how thrilled I am to have had this opportunity to learn more about Deborah Kaplan, one of the great minds of the Jewish Yiddish world today, and still so young, so many years ahead, to be able to continue your work. So go to DeborahKaplan.com. That's Deborah, Debra, Kaplan with a C. .com. We'll put it up on screen, and I look forward to many, many projects in the future, Deborah, that we should try to do together.
That sounds delightful. I would love that. This was such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And, stay tuned for lots of programs at whyilovejewish.org and our continuing explorations of the best in Jewish culture and Yiddishkeit. Thank you.
Why I Love Yiddish Fest 22 is a South Florida extravaganza of Jewish culture. 6 days, 10 events in Miami Beach, Boca Raton, and Coral Springs from August 30th through September 4th, featuring contemporary Jewish headliners, the hit musical concert Stars of David, Jewish rapper Kosha Dills, the award-winning Yiddish comedy duo Yid Life Crisis, and Avi Hoffman, still Jewish after all these years. You don't have to be Jewish to have nachas with the entire mishpucha. Go to yiddishfest.org for more information. yiddishfest.org